You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It is my pleasure to have back again Athenian Stranger. A number of you have messaged me to say how much you've been enjoying having Athenian on as a frequent guest and doing some of these, just breaking down all the bad ideas in modernity podcasts that we're doing. So we have another one for you today. Welcome, Athenian.
I appreciate that intro, but I want the listeners to know that Kryptos has just engaged in what Plato's Socrates called a noble lie. I don't believe for one second that people are messaging them saying they like having me on here. I think Kryptos is just being polite because I was so lost in thought today that I was late for our meeting to have this discussion.
So. I have actual receipts of people who have messaged me to say just that. So no, Athenian is very modest about his abilities. So we can slap each other's backs on how modest and so forth that we are. But no, I'm really glad that the listeners have been enjoying these series, and we have another really good one today. And I don't know how many of these we are going to do along the way. We've talked about maybe doing a series on a significant book. Gadamer's Truth and Method, but we haven't quite committed to that yet because it's a 600-page monster. And that would be a time commitment for just about anyone to kind of work through, let alone talk about. But today we have on tap history and what a terrible idea it is and how you really should abandon your commitment to the idea of history, because history is a foundational idea for the notion of human progress. And this idea of human progress is at the root of much of what ails us today. This idea that the world is going to get better and better and better and better and better. And where does it come from? And against why is it so pernicious? And why you really need to sort of train yourself to stop thinking about history and especially to stop worrying about being on the wrong side of history. Anyways, Athenia, I'll let you start taking it off, and I'll jump in and go. I have some thoughts and things that we can do, but maybe just begin at the beginning. Where did this idea of history come from?
So, this is one of those times where I could end up just monologuing for 4 hours straight. Because this is I am wrapping up my own series of lectures that I'm doing on this topic, as well as on Nietzsche, because this topic was extremely important for Nietzsche as well. My own background in this is also how I found my way towards philosophy. Is initially I was in a math PhD program. My advisor was French, and his wife was also at the university. And it's common practice among the French that if one of your advisors has a spouse who's also at the university, then out of honorable respect, you take their classes too. And so I ended up with a major in history, in addition to the math stuff. And I enjoyed history so much. At this particular university, it was so-called intellectual history, the history of ideas. And I liked it so much that I wanted to also go to grad school in that. And I considered leaving the math program to go do that. However, when I started talking with other guys who knew philosophy, it was becoming very clear that the historians did not know nearly as well what they were claiming they knew as the guys I knew who were in the philosophy department. And what I mean by that is you'll read, for instance, histories of ancient Greece, and along the way, and these are famous histories, they'll bring things up like Homer or Plato or Aristotle, and they will get every single thing wrong about them because they're usually not up to the task of reading the great books, right? I mean, they can understand the notion of chronological history and say these events happened and blah, but what, and this gets us to the very meaning of what history is. It's so-called historiography, which is to say the methods by which one does this thing called history. And what most people do not understand is that history is very new under the sun. I mean, very new under the sun. And not only is it new, it's definitive in ways that we don't even understand, and definitive in a bad way. The way that I phrase it is this: there are two fundamental pillars of what we call modernity. One of them, of course, is what everyone is usually familiar with, known as the mathematization of nature, right? Modern mathematical sciences. They all come from the revolution in mathematics, essentially with Descartes. What they don't realize is that the other pillar, and in many ways more definitive, is this thing we call history. And that's absolutely crucial. There are a number of ways, but let me just simply say this. What we understand as history today, as its own field of study, did not exist until the founding of the University of Berlin in Germany. And roughly, I want to say it was like 1807, either 1807, 1810, or maybe 1813. But that was the first time ever that people could actually choose history as a major in which the methods by which one studies history were free from censure from on the one hand, from the theology department, which it had always been a part of, and on the other hand, the philosophy department, because what had happened is that, and this is the amazing phenomena, is that philosophy becomes historical in the sense that one gets philosophies of history roughly around the 18th century. And it all comes from Germany. And that's where the notion of progress is going to come from, mainly from Hegel. But the establishment of history departments of the University of Berlin fought against that precisely because they said, no, this stuff with Hegel is a little too, that's not real history. That's speculative philosophy, emphasis on speculative. And so that's where we get history from. But the reason that history is so popular, and this is what makes it so dangerous, is this is why I almost wanted to go to grad school for history, because it makes what we otherwise would think of or know as very, very complicated topics, it seems to make them simpler to understand. We say, well, just read the history of it. Like, or hey, if you want to know about Rousseau, well, let's read a biography of Rousseau. But biography is not philosophy. And we have confused that. And here's how crucial this is. And here's how infected we are by history. This is where the word context comes from. And that alone should cause everyone to pause, because what do you always hear whenever people start talking about either politicians, political philosophy, or philosophers? They say, well, let's put him in context. I mean, you have to think of him in context, right? It's like, well, Plato was really a product of the Pythagoreans, and then Aristotle is a product of Plato, but they do something kind of different. And, like with the American founders, they say, well, I mean, this is Barack Obama, of course, is saying, they're a bunch of white slave owners. They could never have possibly understood what we now know of as technology, blah, 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 when they wrote the Constitution, all these things. They have no clue what they're talking about, because these people were far deeper thinkers than they're giving them credit for. And in fact, those people are usually saying that because unwittingly they're admitting how lazy they are. In other words, they're not going to read the Federalist Papers. They're not going to read Plato's dialogues. They're not going to read Aristotle's texts because they're going to read some commentary on them, which is like just one book, usually a slim book. And then they're going to say, okay, so that's really what it's all about, right? And so they
Mm-hmm.
end up not having any context or contact with the original thought of the thinker. But what they do think they have is context, right? Say, well, it's the product of his time, right? And the thing about being a product of one's time is that comes right out of Hegel. And Hegel is the one who gives us this notion of progress in many respects. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's Vico was earlier, but Vico just never, he did, the popularity with regard to the Enlightenment didn't cross the Rhine, the river, until later. And so Vico got there first, but he wasn't known. And then with Hegel, you're off and running with these kinds of things. But that's the issue, is that people associate this notion of progress with history
Mm-hmm.
because they simply believe that because of our technology now, right, that we're smart, that we know more than our predecessors. But what they never ever realize is that science, as we understand it today, is a blind giant. In other words, it can't, science claims to be neutral, right? And technology claims to be neutral. It's not, by the way. Um, they will say it just depends on what one uses it for. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
that's terrible understanding of technology.
yeah, it's horrible. And it's the most common one too. Uh, but what they don't realize is that these notions of good and evil have already been dismissed, right? They've never been
Oh
brought in.
yeah,
And so when you say that something is neutral, it's not neutral because choosing the path of the good has already been set aside, right? I mean,
that's right.
so yeah, and
Yeah.
but that's the key, is that we simply take it for granted, and this has always been the problem of mankind. This is the problem. This is the sin of pride.
Mm-hmm.
We just simply think, or we always naturally want to believe, that we are at least as good as other people, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
the notion of democracy, equality, uh, and that's a problem, and that's extremely problematic because now people believe in these new idols of like AI, all this kind of stuff, and they never realize that there is a wealth of knowledge that fully comprehended all of these things prior to that.
Well,
But on the topic of history, though, especially, think about, for instance, Plato's Republic, the so-called education of the philosophers. What do you not find there? You don't find history. History did not exist. Now, the word for history comes from Greek. It's historia, and what that means is not the chronological events of things, right? The word history is not even in the title of Thucydides' text, The Peloponnesian War. It's not the history of the Peloponnesian War. It's the Peloponnesian War. There's no history in it. Now, Herodotus writes histories, right? The history, but he's going on using the Greek meaning of it. In Greek, the word historia, from which we get the word history, means inquiry. So we're just inquiring into something. That's it. It doesn't mean this chronological accounting of all these things. And Aristotle's going to be the one who's going to really be the first to say, look, this is from the Poetics. What Aristotle says is he says that poetry is more philosophical than history. And he says because poetry tends to deal more with the particulars and history tends to deal more with the generalities of things. But the problem is that the generalities of things are built out of the particulars, right? And that's what he's sort of getting at there. But even that gets contested. I mean, I could run down a list. I mean, it's Polybius. Uh, Another is going to say sort of just the opposite. And then you have all of the Roman. This is actually really fascinating. It turns out that the Roman comics were the best historians and they talk about it too. Lucian actually writes a text called How to Do History. And the reason that they had to know history was because in making satires, they wanted to make sure that they at least understood the events properly. And Lucian amazingly says, I mean, this is just amazing. He says the best historians must have from the outset two supreme qualifications. And those qualifications are political understanding and the power of interpretation. Now, that word he uses there for interpretation, that's the word hermeneutics. So what Lucian says is that, I mean, this should blow everyone's hair right off their head. And this is a Roman.
That's what happened.
It is. And so what Lucian is telling us is he's saying, look, if you're going to engage in the study of history, you can't even begin to expect to do it well unless you have at least these two things, and not just learn them later, but have them from the beginning. You have to have good political understanding, and you have to have good hermeneutical skills, interpretation. We do not have that from our current historians whatsoever. They're all shit libs, so their political understanding is garbage. That's where we get all the revisionism. And they know nothing of interpretation. That's why they get all the authors wrong that they talk about, the great authors that they talk about wrong. But okay, I've monologued. Thank you.
Yeah, wow. No, and it's good because it's given me some thoughts, because I was thinking like, okay, what we maybe need to do for the audience is to step back and to sort of frame, because you're absolutely right. The discipline that we now know of, and the thing that we kind of think of as history, really begins sort of the Wissenschaft, the science of examining historical events. That's sort of like the German stamp that got put on it. And so what we think of today as history, that's where it really comes into its own. But prior to that, there's a long, quote unquote, history I think to understand it properly, we have to go back to sort of the beginning, because people have always been telling and giving accounts of the things that have happened, right? So it used to be that there was just, I think probably the best way to say it, there was just stories. And the stories told the stories of the gods, the stories told the stories of the great kings, and they were all kind of woven together into a collection of stories. And these stories then, as they were told and retold and told again, give the people the meaning for everything. So, and this is something that if I don't know how familiar you are with Eliade, but Eliade talks about originally that, stories exist in kind of a return. So it's cyclical is maybe not really the best way, but probably we would think about it as archetypal. So you would tell these stories because these stories unfold something essential about reality that allows you then to, as you yourself think about the world through these stories, in essence, we would say today, you live into the stories in the way that, in a sense, you become a great man like David is a great man, but you emulate the stories, and then you kind of come into yourself as a person. This is the idea, like the Native American idea of having like a spirit animal or something. So you would have an archetype from the created world, this animal that embodies a certain characteristics. And then by identifying yourself with the animal, you live into those characters and those characteristics become yours, right? But you would do the same thing through the stories. As you move forward in time, or forward, see, even then we say forward in time, but that's again, like it just shows how deeply these ideas are ingrained, that there's a directionality to history. From this sort of basic kind of idea of the story, it undergoes a transformation largely in the Christian era, but you do hear things like, so you get the stories then as civilization becomes more sophisticated, that you get like the annals of the kings are a number of things. So you get the official annals of the kings, and This then would tell you the event of the kings and other great men in a society. But those are often forms of propaganda. So there's this unique, 5th century AD, Procopius, the Secret Histories, which is a remarkable text because after Justinian died, Procopius lets this book that he had been writing, all the things that the real truth about Justinian, sort of the revisionist history, different from the annals, and he kind of lets that get released. So you have the Secret Histories of Procopius, which is a fascinating text if you ever get a chance to read it. But all throughout the Greek period, yes, you have these accounts of the great men, you have the accounts of the great events, but they don't have any what you might call organizing principle other than the idea of the archetype or the necessity to extol the king. So On will talk about this, how with every new king, you have to retell the story so that the current king is seen as a great man. And then other kings will slip into their greatness will slip because the past kings can't be greater than the current kings unless there's a real reason for the past kings to be greater, in a sense that even the current king must emulate the past king because he's so great, right? So you have this kind of archetypal thing working. And what happens in the Christian era is that there is given the archetypal thing still, and you can see this in the scriptures, layers everything. So you have this archetypal understanding of the way that events transpire throughout time. But over top of this, there's a giant superstructure, which you might call the plan of God, right? So God has his promises of salvation that are then realized in Christ, and then the second coming. So you have this architecture that overlies everything. And human events happen within this architecture. Now, for us on the ground, our reality is still largely archetypal. It's almost static in nature. But history takes, events, I say history, but events take a kind of directionality from the level of God. But that remains God's level of doing things. So here on the ground, reality is largely static. Events happen, and you're trying to make the best of things in a reality of living in a world, but you're not really going anywhere. And what changes then in the Renaissance is with humanism, is that mankind, the human being, is made the center of events. And then from there has to be a question. Then this raises, if human beings are the center of events, is there meaning and significance to what we as human beings are doing? Is there a story that we can tell that ties these events together and gives them meaning? And this really is, and it's this kind of centering human beings putting human beings at the center of human events, or of events that go on, and making us the meaning makers of it. Then you, in a sense, kind of cast aside the architecture of God, or what you do is you immanentize it. So then God's workings, his plan that he has, this large archetypes, is worked out through humans within history. So now history has a new directionality in that it's working towards the second coming. And now that it's working towards the second coming of Christ, you can then easily see how this again gets transmuted into technological and the idea of human progress and technological progress. And then you arrive at, in the 1800s in Germany, and now what they begin to doing is say, well, listen, we have to do scientific analysis of these events to examine with academic rigor and scientific scrutiny whether or not the narratives that we are applying to these events are actually justified and warranted by the events themselves. But the idea that these events have a larger meaning has already been fixed in people's mind. And it's a transmutation done during the Renaissance of the biblical idea of the plan of God, which then gets brought down into the plan of people, and we as human beings become the centerpiece of everything that happens. And that's really kind of out of that, then history is born. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to be sort of the big broader picture of how to move it. Now, like as Eliade notes, now then we as human beings now have the burden of history. We must carry ourselves this burden of bringing about utopia. And then on a personal level, it brings about the burden of my life must mean something. My own life must have a story that integrates itself into the larger story of progress. My life must have meaning because I'm at the center of the universe. And so the events of my life must have a directionality and meaning to them. And so now I have to find myself. Now I have to be true to myself. Now I have to have this, and as Christians will often do it, what's God's plan for my life? As if there has to be an overarching, I have to carry the burden of history for myself. And I need to know what the plan for my life is in order for it to have meaning, which in the grand sweep of history is really an idea that's only maybe 100, 200, since the Romantic period, at least maybe 200 years old, 250 years old kind of thing, where this idea that our life has to have meaning is a relatively modern thing. And it's a function of the idea of history, because your life implicitly had meaning before that. And this is hard, I think, for moderns to grasp, that you didn't need your life to have a plan or a purpose or it to have meaning because of the kind of static reality and the way that you interacted with sort of a living creation and all of the archetypes that are around you. The world was just infused with meaning. But now meaning comes from events and not from the metaphysical. So this is kind of that turn that Heidegger observes from a sort of static understanding of being to one that is now being is located on the forefront of time. And that it really requires, Heidegger needs history in order to make his philosophy work.
Yeah, Heidegger is...
That's a different animal. I'm sorry. Again, I threw a lot back at you.
One thing that I want to add some things to this, but I'm embarrassed to say that I made a huge error in something I said previously. Aristotle says not that poetry deals with the universal and history with the particular. He said it's the other way around. So, and that's a big whoopsie on my part. What Aristotle says is that poetry, and in particular tragedy, is more philosophical because it deals with the universal,
like the metaphysical realities.
Right, and history deals with the particulars. So
events that are happening.
Right. So that's the key thing. Now, just something else to add here before we get into the account of how history as we understand it today is born in the Renaissance. This was, as I said, this was being argued effectively when Aristotle puts it on the map. However, also in the archaeology of Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, he's the first one to really critique the poets, much more so than even Herodotus. He dismisses the poet, Homer, and says the problem with the poets is that they make their accounts of things, their logoi, they ornament them, they exaggerate them. And I've got an entire recording on that. That's something different. But so we see where this is going. Like, man was not blind to, the past, right? Because when we're talking about history, we're talking about the past. But in particular, the past that is so far past, we don't have connection to it. We didn't live during it, or we weren't even mature during it, or something like this. Now, what Polybius is going to say, this is another wrong. See, the debates are taking place already. Is it poetry and tragedy, or is it history in the sense of the particulars? And what Polybius says is that he says poetry's aim is to beguile the spectator, even if what is said is not true. Uh, so he's contesting Aristotle right there, and he's actually, we could say he's aligning with Thucydides. But also, and this is something that's very unfortunate, the great Roman Quintilian, who has an awful lot to say about rhetoric, and that's going to be crucial for understanding history. What Quintilian says is, he says that history is very close to the poet. He says, in a sense, it is a prose in poetry, or it is a prose poetry. Now, the reason that that's so important, and with Quintilian regarding rhetoric, and this is also, Cicero is going to be involved in this as well. Cicero is going to have some incredibly important things to say about history, is that people say, well, okay, if history is new, what existed, prior to that, right? If our understanding of history is only a couple hundred years old, okay, well, what existed before that? Well, okay, now we're rolling. History was understood as an aspect of the much more noble learning, knowledge, faculty of knowledge, in fact, one of the liberal arts of rhetoric. And the reason that is so crucial is because this goes back to sort of what you were saying. This is what Cicero has to say. He's talking about Rome. He says, the Roman Commonwealth is founded on ancient customs and heroes. That element right there, ancient custom and heroes. Now, let me make sure I'm trying to decipher my notes because I messed up the days today. Here it is. This is Quintilian. What he says, he's talking about Livy. And everyone should know Livy from Machiavelli, right? The discourses on Livy, right? In other words, history is very important for political philosophy, etc. What he says that Livy's riches, they won't satisfactorily instruct someone who's listening, who's not looking for beauty of statement. He says, but for truth and credibility. Now let me just decipher what that means. He's talking about rhetoric and the role of the study of history. The reason that rhetoric existed prior to history and was considered history is because it provided examples of instruction that people would learn from, and they would see examples of greatness. This is Plutarch, the lives of the eminent Greeks and Romans. Young people needed to see examples of greatness in order to be properly instructed. This is exactly what's going on with the Bible.
That's right. You would weave in making a public speech, you would make your point by weaving together all of these old stories to say, in a sense, this is why we're doing, or the necessity of what we need to do here is because so-and-so did this, and in this great story, he did that. And you would build your case through the retelling of the stories in the public setting.
And there's a famous saying from, I think it's a 18th century French author. He says, all the world loves a lover. Okay. Now that's true. It's like an aphoristic. I mean, it's in a novel that he writes, but it's funny, because it's true. That's what's going on with the role of studying, rhetoric as history, right? So for instance, when Xenophon writes his account of the education of Cyrus, that lasted all the way up to the 18th century as being the book that everyone read. Now, I'll explain why it disappeared in the late 18th and 19th century. But the reason was people would read that and they would say, okay, that's greatness, right? We have an account of someone that's greatness. And it's not so much as Polybius and as the various Romans that I've listed are saying, it's not so much the most important thing that it's completely true, or in some cases might be fabricated, because even Xenophon's Cyrus is very different from the accounts of Cyrus that we get from other accounts. But what's important is that it provides a way for, as I mentioned, all the world loves a lover. All humans aspire towards a kind of greatness. We love to see a winner, right? This is
Mm.
Patton's famous speech. Americans will not abide a loser. The idea of a loser, we hate it so much. We love a winner. We love comebacks, right? This is the story of Samson. Everyone loves a comeback. Samson makes that greatest of all comebacks right at the end of his life, even that it cost him his life. Now, what happens in the 18th century, the late 18th century going into the 19th century, is that modern science has been so successful that people start to say, well, hey, you know, there are laws to science that we have discovered. It looks like there are laws. They're really just probabilities. But they
Mhm.
say that there are these laws of science um, by way of this new mathematics. Can we do something like this with the study of history, right? And so it begins to, and this is when it enters into the discourse of, see, what most people don't understand is that the rise of this thing we call history today is absolutely dependent upon biblical studies. This is where it came in by way of the Renaissance. What happens is that in the Renaissance, and it occurs over the person of Virgil, over translating a particular poem in Virgil, uh, we get the new texts in Christendom, right? The Western Christendom did not have these texts, and they begin to find their way into our tradition by way of the Iberian Peninsula, and all of this. And see, the issue though is that the Catholic Church, which was just, I mean, the church at the time, they had already established doctrine based upon Jerome's translation of the Bible, and as we're getting these new texts, people are saying this is great, and they have to start learning Greek. And in fact, there's the discovery of the Hebrew language. They didn't even know that Hebrew existed. I mean, this enters into we're talking about Elizabethan England with Shakespeare and stuff, the discovery of the Hebrew language. And what happens is that they start saying, well, let's take a look at these different manuscripts that we have of the Bible and start comparing them. And so then you get this debates over whether or not the Septuagint is more reliable than the Hebrew Bible that we already have versus Jerome's Latin Vulgate translator of the Bible. And so all of this is taken off in the early Renaissance. And what occurs is that you have these amazing schools of rhetoric that are absolutely steeped in the knowledge of Greek and Latin, and the students are writing each other and they're saying, "Hey, what do you make of this line in Virgil?" And the guy responds back and he says, "Well, this is what it means." I mean, you sort of apply it like this, and the immediate response after that is he says, "Well, hold on. Is that translation you mean of that particular word right there, is that really what it means in the original Latin or the Greek?" And so this is the question that arises that kicks everything off that we have just been lost in. The claim was, if because there's no such thing as literal translations between one language and another, because it might very well be the case that one particular people had an understanding of a concept that is not, it doesn't even have a correlate to another people's language. And they say, well, it's kind of like this, right? In other words, words are multivalent, right? So for instance,
Mhm.
you say, I love my dog, but then you also say, I love my wife, right? These two things are not the same, right? And so you have to determine between the valency there. That is what happens with regard to the translation of the new learning that comes through in the Renaissance. And what ends up, the debate that gets kicked off is what's going to become known as historicism, because the claim is going to be made, look, if there's no exact correlate to this particular word, if it's only kind of like what we mean when we say this, well, kind of like doesn't tell me I want to know the truth. And they're saying, look, if you flatly did not live at that time, then you're never going to have full access to the truth. And so, in other words, there's no possibility of truly knowing something unless you were in that time. Now, this is going to go on and on for a number of centuries. And what's going to happen is it's going to develop into, this is what Hegel's famous claim is that nobody can be a stepchild of their own time. In other words, you can't stand out of your own time and look objectively on it. See this. So in other words,
And he's right in that regard.
Well, hold on. This entire discussion that we're having right now of history dovetails perfectly with the previous discussion we had on objectivity because the issue is the same. And so the question is, and this is how it has arisen, and this is what I go into in enormous detail with Nietzsche, is to what extent, right, whether and to what extent are we products of our time? So obviously we are products of our time, but the question is how much of the most significant elements to ourselves are changeable from the time in which we live. And you're going to have two radical schools of thought fundamentally. You're going to have many who will say it's so completely unchangeable you have no access to it, right? That's going to be Heidegger. That's going to be this notion of, the middle ground is this thing called objectivity, where they're saying, no, you can't be passionately related to the things in which you're studying. But remember, the whole point of studying the art of rhetoric was to gain these examples to improve your own life. That's exactly why what happens in roughly the late 18th and certainly the early 19th century, all of a sudden everyone stops reading Thucydides, everyone stops reading Xenophon, everyone stops reading Plutarch. Why?
And they stop reading the Bible.
I've left that out entirely because that's really where all of this is coming from, is they're trying to find out if we can apply science to discover what they're going to call the so-called historical Moses, the historical Homer, the historical Plato. And it's not until 1930 or 1835, no one touched on the historical Jesus. They wouldn't do it. David Strauss was the very first who, and the title of his book, it was 2 volumes, and each volume was over 750 pages. It was the first time ever. The title of the book was The Life of Jesus, critically examined by all of the Gospels. So he's looking at all of the Gospels and he critically examines them. In other words, applies objective science to see whether or not the information that we have according to the Gospels provides us with enough evidence to say, yes, these are in fact true. That's going to be very problematic for the whole notion of Protestantism. Well, not the whole notion, but it's for Catholicism as well, because the issue is, look, how reliable is the Bible, right? And having been transmitted down to us. This is exactly what's going on in the Renaissance.
This is the 5 Gospels, the search for the authentic words of Jesus, new translation and commentary by Robert W. Funk, Roy Hoover, and the Jesus Seminar.
Yeah. And there, it's this long thing because Erasmus, right, or Erasmus, however you want to pronounce it, he found over 900 errors in Jerome's translation of the Bible. Now, many of them are just minor, small, tiny grammatical errors. However, a number of them are very significant for the doctrine that has been built up in the interim, during which Western Christendom did not have these access to the like, for instance, the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint or something like that. And so that's when all of a sudden people are going to say, whoa. We're going to need this. We're going to invoke this papal infallibility or something like that, right? And because it is a very big issue, it is a problem, and that's why Luther is going to end up translating the Bible himself. He teaches himself Greek, etc. He was initially friends with Erasmus, but then they have a falling out because he wants to go further and further. But all of that leads up to David Strauss in 1835 or 1834 with The Life of Jesus. And what Strauss concludes is he says there is not sufficient scientific evidence to show that Jesus truly existed. But he says, however, that doesn't mean we have to give up on Christianity, blah, blah, blah. But the cat was out of the bag, and what had happened already, and David Strauss is just the culmination of a tradition that's already going on in Germany, going all the way back to the early Renaissance that I was talking about with Virgil and stuff like that. It is extremely complicated, far more complicated than most people can even imagine. This is the realm of archival manuscripts. The study of archived manuscripts it's enormously complicated. We don't have a single original text of any of the Gospels, anything from Plato, anything from Homer. We have various patchworks of them that are much later, and we have some that are much earlier. In fact, Homer is not the first, the first, like the earliest writing that we actually have of the Greeks is from Heraclitus, right? A pre-Socratic. It's not even from Homer. But everyone knew Homer existed, but we just don't have anything from him. It's very complicated. And
there's a lot more of, and the Homer that we do have is only a small segment of what everyone presumes is the whole cycle of those poems, which were all recited orally at one time. And that's the mind-blowing thing.
That's certainly the claim. Now, the issue, though, is we're not entirely sure because we don't have access to the initial writings,
and we don't have access to the oral poets anymore either.
Right, and so even today, and especially today, you have people who will just rigorously attack, guys like me or something who will want to rigorously read the text that we have that has been compiled, by the way, throughout the centuries of Homer's text, or Plato's dialogues, these kinds of things. And they're like, no, it was an oral tradition, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe, there's a good case to be made for that. But there's also a good case to be made that these people were not so foolish that they didn't actually, have writing capacities and skills and things. We just don't have them. And so that's what all comes tumbling out of this. And the issue, though, this is the great deep issue, is that history pursued by means of this thing known as objectivity, right? That is an acid bath to everything. It is an acid bath to all of the sacred truths. And I would argue, and this is exactly what Nietzsche argues, that it is an erroneous premise. It's based on a false premise because it's based on saying, look, we can distance ourselves from these fundamental texts and just look at them objectively to find out whether or not they're true. Well, okay, ask yourself this. The last time your wife said, baby, tell me why you love me.
Oh, this is an example I use all the time.
Yeah.
Like,
how do you
put that into words?
Exactly. You can't stand outside of your marriage and say, well, let me look at us objectively and I'll give you a list of all the things. Like that's not the human being. Right? That is not what we are.
Can you even put the things that you love about your wife into words? Can they even be captured with language? Or are they just something that's more intuited and felt?
Exactly. Yeah. And all of this, by the way, I have to add is so important for biblical studies because keep in mind what's going on here. If you, and this is a very, very common error that I see made by many, many Christians who understand themselves as being incredibly pious. They will rely upon modern science to try to prove that the Bible is in fact reliable. The problem, though, is that in relying on science, you are yourself having a claim to objectivity. That is not what the Bible, look, the Bible calls for you either have faith or you do not. This is Augustine 101. Augustine flatly says, in a number of different texts, but primarily in his, what I think is one of his most important works on Christian doctrine, he says, unless you actually believe in Christ, the Bible is a closed book to you. Like you're not going
Yeah.
to, it's not for you have to already believe. Now, and this gets us into the question of the hermeneutics, because that's the great issue
Mhm.
is, well, how can I believe if I don't at first sort of critically examine it? But see, that's the modern mind. This is Kant. Kant says our age is the age of criticism. Everything must be criticized. That did not exist. And see, we can't even imagine a world in which that doesn't exist because we're also critical of everyone. That's the influence and the effect of democracy. We have privileged equality so much that we simply get angry if someone else claims a kind of, superior knowledge or something. It's like, well, who do you think you are? It's like, well, I'm someone who's actually read and studied this a lot more than you have. That's who I am. But
Well, we're
nobody
equal
likes
with the
that.
text. We're equal with the text. I'm
And
where
superior to the text. They will believe that they're superior to the text.
and so this gets back to something that I've been just kind of hanging on to, was something that you mentioned via Aristotle. And I was just going to ask you whether Aristotle's reintroduction during the Renaissance really kind of kicked this off, because it probably, this kind of influence was probably not there in the Middle Ages, because I tend to agree with Spengler that the classical era closes with the fall of Rome. And then there's an internegum period, what we would call the Dark Ages, and then there's a new culture born around the year 1000 or so, which I think, to me, it makes a lot of sense just in terms of the development. But that being said, so this thing that you said about Aristotle is that he separated the poetics. In other words, like there's too much influence of the gods in your account of the events of what happened. So there is, in a sense, where in the ancient stories, there's a seamless weaving between the gods, the metaphysical, and the events as we witness and understand them. And it seems that in and through Aristotle, there is a breaking up. So you have to say, well, we have to kind of set the gods, and this is maybe an anachronistic sort of looking back at it from, its effects in the modern era. But you have to sort of separate out the idea of meaning, metaphysical, and then just look at the events themselves and then figure out what really happened. And to an ancient, that is a completely foreign idea. For the ancient person, the metaphysical, the gods, and the events are woven seamlessly together. Otherwise, if the gods were not involved in the story, why would you tell it in the first place? And that's kind of, I think, a thing that, and this then infects today our understanding of scripture, but also then how we do history and so forth, like how we, like the quote unquote science of history. And then we still haven't even gotten into this notion of how the rebirth of history in Hegel, how we give history meaning now with Hegel, with us as the center of the human being, then propels this idea of human progress. But I think maybe go back to this sort of thing, like, is that fair to say that it was the reintroduction of Aristotle during the Renaissance that, in some ways helps facilitate this split between the events in and of themselves and the metaphysical or divine meaning that they have as a separate thing?
So we have to be very careful here.
Of course.
The word we use, metaphysics, that was never used by either Plato or Aristotle. That was Alexandria of Rhodes, I believe, is the one who attached it to the writings that he collated together with the physics, and he called them the metaphysics. Now, that can mean one of two things. It can mean simply, meta just means either after or above. It's a lot like the German word über, can mean over or above. And so metaphysics could simply mean the writings after the physics, or it could mean the writings beyond the physics. Now, that's crucial because what you have in Aristotle with the poetics is when he says that poetry, or tragedy in particular, is more philosophical because it attends to the universal. What he has in mind is the examination of, well, he says the universals, but what he means is the natures of things, right? Things are assumed to have a nature. We speak of, for instance, human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's never plural. Each individual thing has its own nature, period, right? Not natures. That's going to be where the sophists and the sophists come in. They're going to say, no, it's all just words. But what he means is that in discerning what the nature of a thing is, which is philosophy, that's going to be the so-called universal. That would be what you're talking about as far as having a kind of metaphysical element. Now, when he says that history concerns itself with the particular, you don't find, in other words, knowledge of the nature of things, plural, by looking at only just one thing, right? In other words, this is you have to look at, like, you don't know what a tree is by looking at just one tree. It's like, well, they belong in a class, right? So what's common to them, right? This is a whole notion of form in Plato and Aristotle, but Aristotle in the Poetics doesn't refer to the gods or separating out of the gods or anything like that. What he's simply meaning is that with poetry and tragedy in particular, what you get is more knowledge about what we would otherwise think of as nature. The way he phrases it, and it's beautiful in the Greek because literally when you translate it in the Greek, he says the reason that people enjoy going to the theater, right? This is why we get so many people in our orbit who love talking about film. It's like film is philosophy for them. They analyze all these films because Aristotle says that not everyone is a philosopher, but people can enjoy the pleasure attendant upon philosophy by way of discovering that this is that the Greek literally is this is that. In other words, you recognize this is the notion of what you're referring to previously with Iliad as an archetype.
That's
In
right.
other
I was
words,
just about to say that. You're recognizing the archetypes in the
right.
theater, and then the philosopher is the one who discusses the archetypes, but you can recognize them and enjoy them as you see the theatrical production.
Yes, exactly. And what I refer to it as this is what philosophy is. It's a kind of double vision. You see that there is a particular, right, like a cop who's got a face like a pig. And you say, it's kind of funny because, the cops are pigs, right? Some stupid thing like that, right? Like Chief Wiggum from The Simpsons. But you see through that particular because you see, I know someone like that, right? Or someone like a muscular guy like me who's prone to losing his temper. I fit a particular archetype. Someone would look at me and they would say, look at that guy, man. And say, you know what? He reminds me of someone else I know, right? In other words, so you see the particular, but from the particular, you see through it to something else that is a universal, right? That's the whole notion of being more philosophical. And history doesn't provide that. But to the extent that it does or has come to provide that, it's because it's more narrative, right? That's the whole point of Quintilian and Polybius saying that history is like poetry in prose or something like that. So that's going to be the
Storytelling.
key. Now, the reason that Aristotle is so important in all of this in the Renaissance is because, and especially, and this is what my entire series is about on it, is because and this, by the way, is also why Antigone is so crucial to Hegel, right? Hegel always refers to Antigone. He refers to when people throughout his major writings, here's the problem. He says that you can't critique the system, his system, unless you are within the system. And well, in other words, he's providing an answer to the so-called hermeneutical problem, right? How do you get into understanding something if you're not already in it, right? Something like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with faith, the Christian faith. And what Hegel says at a few key points in his major publications is he says, when someone presses me to tell them what the begriff is, the concept, in other words, the Hegelian dialect, he says, when someone presses me for that, all I can really do is point to the mysteries of Antigone. Right now, this is what people need to understand: is Antigone is and it's this we're talking about the story of Oedipus, etc. But or I might have messed that up just because I'm on the fly right now. But here's the thing: what ends up happening with Oedipus is that we have the culmination of the so-called Furies. The Furies were the divine. Yes, the Furies were the divine that would come to Earth, and they would seek nemesis. This is the key word, nemesis. That is a Greek word. They would seek nemesis for injustices that were done. Now, what has happened is that Oedipus, it's often translated as Oedipus the king, but it's really Tyrannus, Oedipus the tyrant. What happens is that they're seeking justice on him, and he's in flight. And I hope I'm not messing this all up, because I often get Oedipus mixed up with the other great
the other plays.
Yeah. Right, the other right. But what happens is that, and this is because it culminates in the founding of classical Athens, which is to say democratic Athens. What happens is Athena has to come down and say, hold on, in order to do true justice, we have to have an element of moderation here, because the Furies are unstoppable. They're going to exact justice in the way that it needs to be done, period. I mean, blood justice, right, we would think of. And Athena comes down and says, no. We're going to found laws, right? And these laws are going to be more democratic, etc. And so that's the establishment of classical Greek democracy. And it's because it is democracy that the whole point of Aristotle is crucial in all of this, because when Aristotle's Poetics comes to us by way of the Renaissance, what's going on in Italy, right? Well, the so-called Italian states, the little city
rise
states,
of the city states.
It's the rise of democracies too, right? I mean, that's the whole point, right? And this is why you end up with Machiavelli, Discourses on Livy. People will say that he's arguing for a kind of republicanism, right? In other words, res publica, of the people. That's why Greek tragedy comes to the fore. So what happens is that you have the Enlightenment on the one hand, but then you have the subsequent and even more important German Enlightenment, because they fixate on Greek tragedy and Antigone in particular, because of this element also of the founding of classical Athens with democracy. That's the Enlightenment ideal, because everyone believes democracy is the way to go. Democracy is very new under the sun. The first time that anyone ever said that democracy was the best form of government was during the 17th century. This is Baruch Spinoza, who actually argues and says democracy is the best kind of regime that you can have. Now, what's fascinating about that, and this brings us back to the notion of biblical history and biblical interpretation, in the text in which Spinoza argues on behalf of democracy being the greatest form of government, it's prefaced, the first 7 chapters really, is the rise of so-called higher biblical criticism. Spinoza blows up the Bible. He says no one can even read the Bible unless you know these various languages. You've got to know Aramaic, you've got to know Greek, and we've got to look at the history of it. And he blows it up. I mean, he just blows it all up. And then after he blows up the Bible, he says, here's what the Bible really teaches. And he gives this hilarious, because it's so stupid, like who would really believe this, version of the teaching of Christ and the Bible in general, that really all you have to do is have a pulse and you're pious, right? Because the bar is so low. And with the bar being that low, then he says, oh, now, by the way, now let's talk about democracy. And so in order for us to have the democracy that we have, that we all claim is so great, the entirety of it is predicated on blowing up the Bible with modern science. And most people don't realize that. And it's like,
sweeping the archetypes away. That in a sense that what we would the metaphysical or divine realities that we're supposed to be aspiring to are swept away, and the Bible itself becomes democratized. Just sort of exactly. It's a guidebook for morality and a guidebook for living your life. Like Jesus rules for living, God's rules for living, and it's just sort of it's brought down rather than, excuse me, you going up to the mountain and, trembling before God and before these great spiritual realities, mediated by Christ. It's all brought down and immanentized and made very plain. And it's made historical.
Let me emphasize what you said because it's so important. It's not that Christianity corresponds with democracy. No, that's not what has happened. Christianity has been democratized. That's what happens. And
yes.
And one thing to add of why it is that Aristotle is so important, because of his writing about poetry, which tells us, because here's also the thing. Aristotle argues that tragedy is the highest form of poetry, and that's how you end up with Oedipus and then, the founding of classical democracy, etc. Now, in conjunction with the emphasis on Aristotle's poetics from the Renaissance all the way through to the German, it's often referred, they often refer to it as, they even use a Greek word, Philhellenism, philia, in other words, love of the Hellenic, the Greek. They say that the German Enlightenment was they were just intoxicated with the Greeks. That's not Philo, yes. And that's not what it was. That's a misunderstanding, because they're trying to emphasize democracy. Hand in hand with that comes Spinoza. This is why it turns out that they absolutely loved Spinoza. Spinoza is crucial for understanding Hegel. He's crucial for understanding all of the German idealists. I just can't emphasize that enough. And what did Spinoza do? Remember, Spinoza blew up the Bible. He argued on behalf of democracy. And oh, by the way, he also gave us the first book ever written in which everything was housed. You had metaphysics, you had ethics, and you had physics, all three together. Those are what Spinoza's text, the Ethics, does. And in it, he provides what is really it's pantheism. And because it's a kind of everything is God, right? We are all God. That's what substance is. Every single substance that exists is all God.
The monad.
Right. And what Heinrich Heine says, he's another famous one in this time. This is in 1835 that he writes this. This is the same exact year of David Strauss writing the Critique. Heine flatly says, the unspoken religion of Germany, and everyone knows it. This is literally what Heine is saying. Says the unspoken religion of Germany, and everyone knows it, is pantheism. In other words, Spinoza. And that goes hand in hand with the democratization of Christianity. So that's, sorry.
And no, it's one of these things. It's hard to explain, because there's one of these common things that you see today where everybody wants to blame Christianity for the problems of modernity, whereas it was in many ways the gradual corruption and unwinding and undermining of Christianity by modernity, in a sense that modernity was a force acting on Christianity. And so at each point at which it's undermined, you can argue that there was something valuable that they were trying to reclaim. So you could say in the Reformation that you're trying to reclaim the scriptures for the common man, in a sense, though, that it's not, which in itself, like, you should be reading the Bible, but we also have to understand that in democratizing the Bible, there were certain downstream effects to that. And there were a number of them. One of which is that it erodes authority. And it also, in a sense, that if the scriptures are fully legible, then you've in some sense made God legible, and you've made the holy legible. And in some ways, if you think and you say like sola scriptura, if truth can be found in words and reason, then you can almost, it actually in a sense makes the point of the Enlightenment for it. So in a sense, you're adapting Christianity to a world of the Enlightenment in which there is no metaphysical. Now, this doesn't mean that people shouldn't be reading the scriptures. but they need to do it not in a background of the Enlightenment where Kant has cut off the metaphysics. That's, I mean, it's sort of the end result of it, but they need to do it in terms of a more Augustinian, where you have these scriptures in the hand, but they're pointing you up the mountain to go climb the mountain to God. Right. And so, and that's the kind of the element that we've lost in stripping bare of all of these things, of their metaphysical pretensions. We're going to find the real truth of them. We're going to find the real David, the real Jesus, what really happened in the Old Testament. We're going to have to find out what really happened in Genesis, all of these types of things, rather than understanding that these stories are integral pieces. And once you begin to break them apart, they're in many ways, they're done. Like, and then they all have to be reconstructed and rebuilt. And in a sense, that's what Hegel does, in my mind, is that Hegel takes all these scraps and he rebuilds them from the ground up. And it's almost like Obama. We are the ones we've been waiting for, right? And so Hegel then says, like, here is the grand sweet, spirit is found in the people, right? So we're united together as a people. And we as human beings are emerging on the front of history, and we're moving towards this great unfolding of whatever it is that's unfolding. We can't know it until the eye of Minerva finally takes flight. When we get there, we'll know it. And that's what I'm right. But this is, and then so now you get, it's, once all of the the spiritual realities, metaphysical realities have been stripped away, everything's been democratized, you're scientifically analyzing the text, you're coming at the real truth of the text and all these things. It now has to all be put back together. And then it is this idea of Hegel that then gives meaning back to the text in this idea of history. And you think like, oh, really? But it's surprising how much, given that when at the same time you're making sort of technological advance upon technological advance upon technological advance, as that's starting to emerge with industrialization and so forth, it's very easy when somebody says, hey, here's what's happening with the grand sweep events. We as a people are marching forward to some glorious future, that everybody went, well, yeah, that's obvious, right? And now you've moved from the the medieval period through the Germans, now through Hegel. Now you have the idea of history. And then alongside of it, almost at the same time, you have Darwin, who's applying the same schema cosmologically, in a sense, almost, to like all of life emerges in this same pattern towards the glorious future. It's all evolving, and then you get Rousseau, a little bit earlier, but that we can engineer society, and if we could just educate everybody properly, then the good, or they'll just naturally emerge into the good, right? And so it all gets sort of pushed into the grand sweep, and everybody kind of believes there's this profound optimism about what we as in it, like you say, it's democracy, it's all of this mix of stuff, and it just gets thrown in and everyone embraces it. And then Marx adds his layer on it. Well, kind of what Hegel was talking about, but it's all basic economics, and then that next thing, so you shift again from like with Hegel, where you have the people and the race, now it's just class. And so the history now moves through class conflict. And in a sense, class conflict is really the key that kind of unlocks Hegel and universalizes it in a sense, and makes it, in a sense, because there's class conflicts everywhere. At least that's my sense of it. And then it's all kind of coming together right around this same period in history, in the middle of the early to middle 1800s.
Yeah, one thing I would say, just a few points. So,
sure, no,
I'm glad you brought up Darwin, because a lot of people say that Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species is like it was the most revolutionary text published. David Strauss's text was earlier, and I would argue that Darwin would not have been nearly as successful as a text, were it not for the fact that David Strauss published his and sort of opened up the Pandora's box of it. Now, what you're describing is, well, just on Hegel real quickly though, what I would say is that for him, fundamentally, it's the principle of contradiction that's going on all the way down to the minute level of literally of being itself. Being itself has these contradictions in it, and so everything it's constant conflict in coming to what he's going to refer to as consciousness, and then ultimately the spirit becoming aware of itself, and then but whatever. It's the problem of Frankenstein is the way I like to phrase it.
Mm-hmm.
Modern science is excellent at breaking things up. In other words, analysis. It is not very good at putting things back together. In other words, synthesis. Both of those words are Greek. Both of those words are definitive for Plato and Aristotle. This is exactly why Plato's Socrates, the critique that he has of writing in general, because he says that writing has to become a living creature to the person who's reading it. But it's so difficult to do that because our souls are so unique. And so that's why Socrates didn't leave any writings. He just talked to people, because the logos, the logoi, had to be adjusted to everyone's individual soul. In other words, even more importantly, the human soul cannot be abstracted. It cannot be generalized. That's enormously problematic for this belief in, writing being able to solve the problems of the world or something, or mass literacy. Now, Bacon himself flatly uses, he's right on the heels of Machiavelli regarding the appropriation of Christianity. Bacon flatly uses biblical language to turn Christianity liberal. He says, we are going to put new wine in old skins. He's talking about words. He says, we're going to still use the Christian words for virtue, charity, etc., but we're going to redefine what those mean. That's going to be the liberalism. And let me be perfectly clear about what liberalism is. It is radical toleration. That's what liberalism is. Radical toleration. That is a very, very slippery slope from radical toleration to relativism to nihilism. That's where we're at now. And it was always there. Now, what's so important to understand about this, and this is why I do not like the word secularization. Many philosophers that are very popular, Charles Taylor writes entire texts called Secularization. And many, many people liked them. When I was in graduate school, I had a number of colleagues who just, they couldn't get enough of Charles Taylor because of his book, Secularization, etc. He recently wrote a follow-through to it. It is not secularization that happens in the Enlightenment. In other words, it's not a kind of falling away from Christian tradition. It is anti-biblical from beginning. So it was deliberately anti-biblical. That's what's going on at the founding of modernity. And then downstream of that, you get the falling away. And that was what they intended. So
there's a gradual rejection and undermining of key biblical, because it's sort of step by step. And oftentimes it was done with the idea of, we're going to inquire into the truth of things here. Or we're going to, we're going to rescue the word of God from the hierarchy and the corruption of the church. So at every stage, there was, in some ways, almost, this is something people have to remember, there was almost a justifiable argument to be made for why they were doing it. Like when you go back and you read it, like you can see how if you're walking in their steps, they felt very justified in what it wasn't like there was some grand conspiracy, but step by step, little by little, in their attempts to rescue Christianity, they gradually undermined it step by step by step by step, until at some point you end up with a hostility. The outright hostility to Christianity then kind of emerges in the 17 and 1800s, fully formed.
Yeah, let me emphasize something here, because this is very important. I see this all the time on X. Maybe it exists in real life, I don't know, but I see it on X all the time. You have a number of people who say many of them are very large accounts, and I'm friends with many of them. But they will say, for instance, Catholicism saved civilization. They built the West, or something like this. This is not entirely accurate at all. It's only partial, very partial. What is always forgotten is that the religious wars, just ask someone next time, hey, do you know how many people died during the religious wars? They wouldn't even begin to know that there were millions. These were Christians killing Christians in the name of Christ. So
it was devastating.
It was absolutely devastating. Millions within a span of like just a few decades.
And they had to ask, how do we prevent this from happening?
So exactly. And the way that I phrase it is this: people like Hobbes, people like Spinoza, people like John Locke, very, very anti-biblical. They were writing under duress because they looked around and they said, this is not sustainable. This is literally what they were saying. They're like, guys, and I love the way that the word they use is hilarious. They said, guys, Mohammedans are already taking over Jerusalem, and we're over here killing ourselves by the millions. What's going on? And so what they had to do is they had to find a way to temper the religious zeal that was taking place in the West, in our own home, that was slaughtering our entire way of life. And the problem, though, is that they were too successful. What they kicked off was, it worked too well. It led to the road of outright where we are today, where people just don't even really believe. I mean, even people who, they don't want to say they're not Christian, so they even might still go to church on Sundays. But when you look at their lives Monday through Saturday, I mean, for all practical intents and purposes, they're not Christian. I mean, they're just not believers. I mean, they're liberals because they have virtues of like liberal charity and compassion, but it's not the same as Christian compassion or Christian charity. It's not at all the same. And so they were too successful. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, and the important thing to keep in mind here is that all of these things were being made in the name of what is going to be called history. Look at Hobbes's Kingdom of Darkness and the Leviathan. Look at Spinoza's critique of the Bible. All of these things are it is history in the scientific sense that's being deployed in order to bring these things about, to make them more persuasive. Right? That's the key, is that it is a kind of rhetoric that sounds plausible based on the fact of the results that we're seeing, the amazing results that we're seeing from modern science. And so that's how we end up effectively where we are. And it was not just, by the way, Protestants. This is nothing that angers me. It was not just Protestants. It was absolutely a number of Catholics. Look at Descartes. Look at Pascal. So it was not a denominational kind of thing. These were people who were looking around based on politics alone saying, my God, we are slaughtering each other. Like, we've got to come to a consensus here. We've got to find a more healthy way to show our religious zeal. And what comes out of it is commerce, trade. So.
Yes. And what people don't realize, like, there's all of these different sort of historical movements. So again, beginning with, say, Venice in the 900s, with the rise of Venice, Genoa, and these other Italian trading states, and you're getting the rise then of the city charters because as other European princes see the success that's happening in Italy, they think, how can we emulate the influx of money with the merchant classes? And so then you get, the city charters and all of these things that they can operate sort of outside of the normal rules of the old seigneurial and feudal systems. But people also don't recognize too that Europe really wasn't fully Christianized until, what is it? The Scandinavians, like in the 1400s, these types of things where, and so what ends up happening, like the religious wars that begin sort of with the breakdown, like in the High Middle Ages and the corruption of the church, is largely an outgrowth of the success of Christianity. In a sense, the splits that came because of the Protestant Reformation were in many ways a sign that Christianity had become a luxury belief. And so now you could, because it's inconceivable to think of other peoples in other eras, like as you mentioned, like the, Islam or whatever, turning in on themselves this way, and then battling themselves for, the true faith, that it's kind of one of these events. So now they have this huge bloodletting over who has the right interpretation for Christianity. And
that's an extremely important point, because what happens with the transmission of the texts, how we even end up with Plato and Aristotle, it first comes through by way of Islam. And the first generation of Islamic, what we would think of as Islam does not have theology. It's like Judaism. It is a religion of law. It's a religion of law. So what we think of in Christianity as theology, for Islam and Judaism, they have jurisprudence. These things cannot be correlated. They're radically different. That's, by the way, why you never want to use the word Judeo-Christian. But anyway, the point was this: what the first generation of the Islamic scholars did when they were reading Aristotle, they started writing about making room for philosophy within Islam. And they were incredibly deep thinkers, and almost immediately they were deemed heretical. And what happens is you end up having a text get written called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And almost immediately after that, there were basically three primary great Islamic scholars who were really more philosophy than Islam. And what happens is that they get wiped out. And so when people say, you'll often see texts say things like, why did it only happen in the West? In other words, the Enlightenment and science. Well, it's because Islam recognized immediately that philosophy could be extremely dangerous for their religion. And so they quashed it. But in quashing philosophy, they also quashed the possibility of what would become known as natural science. In other words, our future understanding of science. Mm-hmm. And so they did not have an enlightenment. And that's why we think of the Middle East. To the extent that the Middle East is now prospering is also at the great detriment of how it is that they're faithful. That's why usually first generation Islamic immigrants to America are radically different in their faith than their parents. They're just not, they've been Americanized, they've been Westernized for that exact reason. But that's extremely important for people to understand, is that they squashed it. They squashed philosophy really quickly. And so you see the great difference between the West and what we'd otherwise refer to as the Orientalism, right? The Middle East, et cetera. So.
Well, and one of the things once you begin to, break apart and you go down the route of Hegel and you've immanentized, the activity of God, and you've brought it into the realm of human events and made human beings the central figures in the realization of the second coming of Christ and the new heaven and the new earth, is that once you immanentize everything, then the medium, the vehicle, and this has always been, in a sense, when you're recounting historical events, it was always the annals of the kings, right? So in this sense, what happens is that you move from being a sacral society where the church and the crown work together to maintain the spiritual well-being of the people, to now the church becomes a handmaiden to the political realization of the kingdom of God. And that really then politics, rather than the church, becomes the center of life, because politics is the center of historical activity, not the church. And that's really where you have this shift occurring within, quote unquote, history. But this is how events shifted from a sacral society in which everything revolves around, the faith and the worship of God and the life of the church, saint days and the religious holidays. And now, since God is now working through history and God is now realizing himself in history, and soon that the divine aspects of it will be cleansed, Christians will become handmaidens to the larger idea of progress, which was emerging on its own. Once Christianity could be, kind of this is sort of the end result, is that now politics becomes the chief means of religious expression.
Yeah, let me make sure to emphasize just one last thing. I know we're running kind of long here,
Yeah.
but I want to make sure that your listeners understand something. Literally the only reason that this thing known as progress is so intoxicating is because of the fruits, whether they're ripe or rotten, of modern science. We believe that because of our technology, we say, I mean, look at us. We're talking by way of, this computer, everything is, we never even would have known each other were it not for this. We mistakenly conflate the advancement in knowledge of science to make our lives more comfortable. We mistake that for progress. And let's emphasize what that means: to make our lives more comfortable in this world, right? Is that what the job of the Christian is to do? Is that progress for the Christian? Last time I checked, ours is not of this world. It's for the afterlife, right? So that's been completely lost. That's been, and people they don't get it.
I'm in the middle of preaching a sermon series on Job, and modern people it's almost impossible for moderns to grasp the book of Job, or to, in part because we no longer grasp the idea of take up your cross and follow me. Like I just preached on Job 23, right? Job wants to bring his case before God, and he's not even really trying to question God, like, why are you doing this to me? But he's coming to God and saying, I want God to declare, I want to go into the court of God and have God declare Job is a righteous man, that these things didn't happen to him because he was an upright man, and these things didn't happen to him because he was wicked, which is what his friends had been telling him. So in many respects, Job's integrity was far more important than his material possessions, his children, or his health. But in chapter 23 of Job, what happens is he wants to find God, but he can't find God. Who knows the way to God? Who knows the way to God, right? Well, who is it that reveals the way? Christ. I am the way, right? And so you're drawing on all of these things, and people used to be able to do this. You're drawing on all these themes from the Old Testament passages. So Jesus is picking up in his declaration all of these passages from books like Job. I am the way, I'm the truth, and the life. Well, he's saying that I am the way. Well, where does the way get him? The way is the cross. And where does he end up on the cross? What does he end up howling out? This is God who becomes man, who then, and my God, why have you forsaken me? And so Jesus himself plunges himself, Jesus, God who has becomes man, plunges himself into the reality that was Job's, where he cannot find God. And this is, in a sense, the dying and rising. So the Christian life is one of take up your cross and follow me. You're going to die and you're going to rise. You're going to come to a place. In order to find God, you're going to be brought to a place where you can't find him, if that makes sense. And so you're dealing in what the very deepest mysteries of earth. This is also how you find wisdom. This is also how you meet God on the way. And this is why the ancient spirituals would talk about the desert experience, the dark night of the soul. You have to wander 40 years in the desert before you can find the promised land. And modernity says that you don't need any of that. We can just build it through technology. We can just manage our way into utopia. Like, you don't need any of that stuff. And so as a modern Christian, the idea, the fundamental idea, in the sense, well, you say, well, isn't it a gift? Well, yeah, it's a gift. But Jesus himself says it's a gift that's going to cost you everything you have. It's the pearl of great price. So in a sense, it's a gift, but how hard do you want to work to get the thing that's, again, so you work out your salvation with fear and trembling. But because we've so rationalized the gospel, we can't grasp the idea that at every turn, there's a fundamental mystery that can only be talked about through these very ancient stories that then layer upon layer upon layer that, in a sense, reveal the poetics, the metaphor, the archetype that lies underneath it. In a sense, once you're there in the experience, you will understand the truth of it. You'll grasp it. But what can you grasp? Well, you can't talk about it, because how could you put such a things into words? And that's the fundamental. And this is part of the problem that we get now with modernity, when everything now is rational. We can examine all things. We can come to the rational truth of everything. Is that and this is the funny thing is in trying to come to the truth of everything, we've actually cut ourselves off from the truth, because we've cut ourselves off from the metaphysical, because we can no longer grasp the things that somebody that lived 3,000 years before Christ or 1,500 years before Christ, that they understood it perfectly well, a thing that we can't understand because we're framed within a technological reality and because we try to pursue truth rationally without regard to the metaphysical.
Yeah, let me.
We're not even really pursuing truth. We're just measuring things.
Yeah, let me point out something here, because this is so important. I was going to mention it earlier, but this is a perfect way to sort of segue, and then we wrap things up. Yeah. Is the rationalization of the Bible is preempted in the Bible itself from the very beginning.
Oh yeah.
Let's think about this, because what gets created before the sun and the stars? Light. Well, how can that be? Well, right, and so this is the teaching there. I believe this is the teaching there. Long in, for instance, Egypt, the sun was a god, right? But by beginning creation itself in a way that we can't even explain, it's like, what are you talking about? Like the light comes from the sun and the stars. Like, you can't have light before the sun and the stars. That's the point. Is it saying, look, these other things are not gods, right? This is how things created.
Yeah, you worship them, but they are dependent upon a reality that's greater than them.
And more importantly, even one that we can't explain. That's right. The book of the opening chapters of the creation account. What's the most thing that's characteristic about it? It's very short. It's what we want to know the most about, but it's incredibly condensed, and we're not given access to the most important thing that would otherwise make sense, that the Greeks are going to refer to as the cosmos, right? Planetary systems and things like this, right? This is where we get light from. Light comes from the sun and the stars.
No, it doesn't.
Exactly. Biblically, no,
it comes from God.
Right. And he doesn't provide us any logos further than to simply say, because I created it. That's how.
Which is ultimately the answer that he gives Job.
Exactly.
Where were you when I made the heavens?
Right. Exactly.
Right.
And I think that has to be emphasized, because what's being said here by us is that within the first couple pages of the Bible itself is saying, don't rationalize me. Don't try to deploy your logoi on me. And this gets back, as I said, to Augustine. Augustine just flatly says, if you do not already love and believe in Christ, the Bible is a closed book. And that will drive moderns. It drives moderns insane. They're like, what are you talking about? You're asking me to believe something without even examining it? Well, that's not me. I mean, look, it's the Bible. So you take your issue up with the Bible.
And that's like Heidegger is Kierkegaard is the same way. Kierkegaard came to the same realization that you have to take a leap. And there is this sense too where the scriptures can only take you so far. If you remain enclosed in the scriptures, you're never actually going to meet God. You'll meet the idea of God, but meeting the idea of God is not the same thing as meeting God. And in the modern world, we don't understand this. And it's in part because of this relationship that we have with history, that we can't grasp the idea that the idea of God is not the same thing as God himself. And we have, and this I think is, and I think Heidegger is right, that we have enframed ourselves within the system of not only just technology, but rationality, where every answer is technological. And this is what Ellul says. is that, and this to me is always, it's the technological system and the technological society, which is, and science, and Ellul flips it on its head. He says that science is actually based on the technological imperative, because in order to, you can theorize all you want, but in order to actually do the scientific method and test things, you need the technology to actually make the measurements. So technology precedes science. And so we think of ourselves, oh, we live in a scientific age. Is actually, no, we live in a technological age, because, and then technological thinking is the fundamental ideology of the modern age, is a sense that all solutions to every problem are fundamentally technological and systematic. And so it doesn't matter. And so this is like politically, whether you get left or right, you know, the left's set of plans and the right set of plans are both technological plans. So you have a deeper ideology that underlies and supports both the left and right politically. And that is the technological system. And the technological system is based on the technological imperative of technological advancement, that I constantly iterate and improve today's technology, that, you know, and the underlying, it's a soteriology. And so you have this underlying soteriology, and the soteriology is the thing that impels the soteriology is this notion of history, that things are moving, events step by step by step by step. We're moving, quote unquote, forward as we advance technologically. And as we advance technologically, we are step by step iterating a better and better and better and better world for ourselves. And this is, in a sense, is that before you can do anything else, you have to challenge this fundamental idea that the world is getting better through technology. And this is, I think, you know, this is where we come out with history, but the money payoff. And this is the thing you have to come at to, in a sense of like, are we better human beings because of the technological society? Well, moderns would say yes. And, you know, modern liberalism says yes. Even modern, what we call conservatism, says yes. And much of modern conservatism is also built on the same idea of human progress. It's transmitted through, rather than being, you know, a more globalist, we shift the idea of progress to that of the people or the race. And so but it's all, in a sense, progressive in that regard. Hitler was just as much a progressive as FDR. And people have, once you understand this notion of history, like the 1,000-Year Reich is itself a progressive notion built on the fundamental idea of history. And so once you grapple with the notion of history and come to history, you realize just how foundational and fundamental it is. And you cannot grapple with our current moment politically until you're willing to reject the idea of history. But to reject the idea of history is to reject almost everything around you.
Yeah, just to put some meat on those bones. This is Francis Bacon. The logical works of Aristotle are loosely connected, and they were always known as the organon. Now, think of what that means. An organ, right? An organ to deal with, to manage knowledge, logic. Bacon writes, the new organon. Well, what is the new organon? Well, this is experimentation. The new organon, in other words, man needs things like microscopes, thermometers, etc., etc. Man himself is not capable of coming to true knowledge without new organs beyond logic, etc., etc. Now, one thing I left out about Spinoza when he blows up the Bible with his use of modern science is he says the following. He says, we can't, it's not that we don't believe in miracles. We just have to set them aside because it might be the case, as we've just found out by way of Descartes, etc., that we don't have the science yet that explains the events. Now, here's the problem with that. When you say, let's just bracket miracles because we just might not have the science yet, guess what happens? You never go back to the miracles. because you're always saying, well, maybe we just don't have enough science. We just need more science, more science. And so this is the so-called question concerning technology, is that you keep throwing more and more science at the issues. And eventually what happens is you have a generation that wakes up one day and doesn't even know what the original issues were. Now, the way that this happened in the Enlightenment was the universities put out these public writing contests. And the most famous one that put Rousseau on the map, the question was this: has our increase in technology improved our morality? This is at the high tide of the Enlightenment, and everyone is submitting answers saying, absolutely, yes, look at how great we are. Rousseau is the one who says no. And then he gives this account of why it's made us worse. Because technology increases new needs that we otherwise would not have already had, new desires, and we chase those new pleasures. And what happens, that translates into the German Enlightenment with this is how it turns into history. Then they start to ask, then the famous question put forward after that is, what is the origin of human language? And it's none other than Herder, right? See, because Rousseau is also going to write another essay on the origin of human language. This guy Herder is going to say, you know what? Man creates language. It's not God. And it was considered scandalous. Well, why was Herder so important? See, in other words, we've moved into the realm of history from science, from technology into history. So history is a version of technology. And Herder is the one who says we create language. Man can create language. And then
the word.
Everyone is off and running, trying to figure out this, how it is that how language itself arises. And this transforms into the field known as anthropology. And Herder, by the way, is the one who gives us the word for the spirit of a people, the Volk, the Geist. That's where it comes from. He also gives us the word for humanity. So these words didn't exist prior to this. And it's going to be building on the work of Herder that none other than Kant steps in and says, all right, let's see if we can finally get a definitive answer to this. And then once Kant steps onto the stage, the notion of history, he writes this famous essay called Conjectural Speculations on human history, etc. And then, of course, that's going to deeply involve questioning the divine. And then you look at his text on the he titles it "Religion Within the Boundaries of Pure Reason." And then and then everything is off and running. And then by the time you get to well, it's not even Hegel. I mean, it goes even further. And this just gets us to Heidegger. Is going to be this claim that, I mean, it's philosophy itself is fundamentally atheistic. It begins in atheism. In fact, Heidegger at one point flatly conflates. He says technology is atheism. I mean, he just says it. But anyway, I mean, we're going to end up talking forever because you see how much I love the subject.
So. Oh yeah, I know. And I'm going to add one last final point, maybe, and I don't know if you had a couple of, but the thing you said there too is that they're always looking for, in a sense, now that you've excised, God from everything, progress justifies itself because in a sense you're always the next technology, that will be the thing that fun. And what do we see today in LLMs, what's called AI? Is the claim of quote unquote emergent properties, that we've made these algorithms so complex and these databases so complex that even though they know deep down that these are fully legible, that if you wanted to take the time, you could read every last scrap of data in there, they make the argument that these algorithms that intelligence is going to be an emergent property because in so doing, if intelligence can emerge out of the computer through an emergent property, then this would justify all of human progress. And really the whole thing of AI is that it is a justification for, like, in a sense, this is the final proof that human progress is what it is. They don't necessarily, maybe not even, some of them, I think, understand it, and I think this is why many of the technological guys, even though they realize that they're unleashing horrors upon mankind, realize or believe in their own minds that we're right on the cusp of finally doing it.
Yeah, that's the kicker right there. We're so close. We're right there. We're right there. I mean, but what needs to be understood, especially here, is that that's why Marxism just won't die. People always say, well, it just hasn't been done properly yet. It will work if we can just get people to finally do it the correct way. This is how to do it. In other words, they're always just right on the edge, because they're just not going to separate themselves from their commitment to the premise that they're right there on the cutting edge, and that they might have, in fact, left something out that's entirely fundamental to what it means to even be human in the first place, as they're claiming to guide us into this new thing known as transhumanism and such. It's not transhumanism. It's trans subhumanism, because they haven't properly understood the human as such. But anyway, that's my.
So this is kind of, I think, but this is a sense, again, why it's so important to understand this notion of history, because without then you can't properly understand where this idea of human progress came from, because the two are integrally connected. And even Ellul makes this point that you cannot begin to grapple with the reality of the administrative state until you can reject the idea of history. And
yeah, I mean,
this is what many on our side just cannot wrap their heads around, and why the vast, overwhelming majority of them are ultimately progressives when you push on what their fundamental core beliefs are.
Yeah, I mean, the great problem here is that there are two things that no country can even allow itself to fall behind in without literally causing an existential national security threat. And they've merged into one thing now, but it's economics on the one hand and technology on the other. And so what happened when we kicked off this whole thing of technology is that we can't fall behind in it now, because if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And they will, if you let another country do it, like China or something, I mean, they're happily going to make us their little vassal slave fiefdom or something like that. And so we're stuck in this issue. This is when things begin to sort of explode, and you realize just how complicated they are. But the point being, though, your point being, that understand, like, I would go even further and say it's not that progress and history are fundamentally related. It's that progress has become what people think history itself is. And this is what, and it's a technological problem precisely because it's this issue of managerial science, right? Mm-hmm. When Heidegger writes his essay, The Question Concerning Technology, when he talks about what he refers to Gestell, standing reserve, mm-hmm. The accumulation of things for future projects, the first example that he lists, which I find is absolutely hilarious, and I've not found anyone who's ever pointed this out before, the first example that Heidegger gives of technology that we use is human resources departments. He says the human resource department. That's your primary example of what technology is. Humans, we have turned humans into resources. In other words, standing reserve, Gestell, objectified them, right? Made them soulless, right? They're not people with souls. This is when people say it's nothing personal, it's just business. Oh, I see. So you're just being objective. So in other words, I don't have a soul, right? And so all of it is just deeply problematic, because it's like, well, how do we now reconnect the spiritual? Well, I don't even like that word spiritual. How do Christians reclaim Christianity when you can't let go of technology at this point because of national security risks? Or it's not that you can't. I mean, what I think it's ultimately going to involve is a different, it's just going to require a different form of governance. And it's going to be something that it simply does not reconcile with everyone's walking under the banner of egalitarianism and various freedoms and things like that. I mean, because this is what has happened when you have allowed, equality at all costs to occur.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to, I think, before you run off to save the nation from itself and impose Christianity on people, which I think, given everything we said here, probably should be best understood as simulacrum of what we kind of think Christianity should be in that regard. But I think it really involves, and this is, I think, something that Christians need to really, really take seriously, is that it has to, in a sense, involve a going back to the beginning, and not in a sense of like a revolutionary where we sweep everything aside, but that we start at square one with, in a sense, ascesis. We make the effort to meet God, to break out of the enframing of the technological world. So prayer, worship, community, all of the things that are tangible and real, but it really becomes with reconnecting ourselves with the ontological reality of God. And this is, I think, why Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce sort of that he latched on to ontologism, that in a sense, and I think he's correct, that it's the living connection with the divine that grounds knowledge. And it's just moderns don't want to hear this, but it's the things that you can't explain about God. It's the miracle. Miracles act, and that's the thing. Miracles actually ground science. Science doesn't prove or disprove miracles. And that's, I think, the thing that moderns cannot wrap their head around. And that's kind of where we have to go back to again, is to rediscover that miracles ground everything. I mean, again, that's, we said this before. I think we mentioned this in our talk on the friend-enemy distinction. This is why Schmidt talks about miracles as the foundation for law, because ultimately they are. The miraculous is the foundation for law.
Yeah, and keep in mind Spinoza. What did Spinoza tell us? He said we have to bracket miracles because we might not have the science. And so when you hear Christians especially championing science, that's a red flag, because you should say, do you understand? And this is absolutely crucial. Do you understand that the very premise of science is that no miracles, right? Or at least bracket them off. So,
or they subordinate them to science.
Right. And so, I mean, that is such a, I mean, that literally just, I mean, might as well just take the Bible and throw it away. I mean, and they don't, getting them to understand that is almost impossible, because they're so intoxicated with this notion of objectivity in science that, and they claim that on the one hand, it's like this, that they have the Christian understanding that God is the truth. But then they say, because God is the truth, anything else that is the truth has to be, it has to correlate with God. And they say, well, if science is true, then science has to correlate with God. What they fail to recognize is that the premises of science are anti-biblical. This is Descartes. Descartes flatly says, as a principle, I'm going to doubt everything, fundamentally doubt it, unless and until I can myself demonstrate it, or the word he uses that's definitive of all modernity is I can construct it. Well, how does Descartes and how do everyone just construct anything? Mathematically. So there you are. You're stuck in the technological cycle, and the Bible is not in that by default, by definition. And so, but getting people to understand that it's so foreign to them, because, I mean, we're now over 100 years at least into this long-standing tradition of people trying to use modern science to justify their faith and everything. And I mean, that itself throws faith out the window. It's like, if you got to demonstrate your faith by way of science, I mean, then what is faith, right? Yeah.
But yeah, anyways, we after we said we got to wrap this up, we've spoken for another half an hour. So it's.
Do you see what I did? I turned this into an Athenian space where I kept promising it would be over, but then it was not over. So
I know. It's he said it would be an hour, but it's not an hour. Yeah,
I know. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
No worries. Hey, I'm just as guilty here too. Like I enjoy these conversations. To be honest with you, I think that that these are very, very important things for people. Like we need to do. It seems like, why are we doing philosophical discussions when there's so much news to talk about? Because in a sense, these types of discussions are far more important than discussing the events of the day. If you discuss the events of the day, you end up just being a slave to the moment. Yeah.
Right. These discussions of the grounding foundations are why the events of the day are taking place. But the events of the day never talk about these. They never simply say, look, hey, by the way, did you know that science denies miracles? I mean, they're not going to say that. And so that's why these are absolutely essential, I think. And I hope that people enjoy them as much, listening to them as much as guys like you and I enjoy talking about them and sharing them. So.
Well, and I think the more that you and I have and others have these kinds of conversations, the more I think that we're able to communicate that to an ever wider audience. And the more that the ever wider audience begins to grapple with the reality within which they find themselves and question, does this have to be the way things are? Or what is it like, is the story that I've been told since I was a child, what if it isn't true? What if there's a different story that would explain things better, and give my life meaning? And that's really, I think, kind of what we're doing. Because then we say, well, it all begins once you get, like, as we say, once you get back to that beginning and you've made the journey up to the mountain to meet God. Then when you come back down and know what's really real, everything in the world around you, you'll see it for what it is. And that's a simulacrum, and that you're living within a simulacrum. And now that you understand the real, again, Plato in his cave, right? And so that's, in a sense, kind of what we're doing, is trying to get people to come out of the cave and see the sun.
Yeah, look, and I just really appreciate you having me on as much as you do. It's a great honor for me. I can't thank you enough. So.
Well, you're welcome. And then, it's funny, every time I think I just had Athenian on, but then you and I just kind of like, this is a problem, is in group chats, people will drop stuff and then I will text you 5 minutes later.
Yeah.
Rather than spurg out in the group chat, let's just you and I have a conversation.
Right.
Let's do it. Yeah. That's probably the better way to do it.
It's hilarious. We're like school kids texting each other all day.
I know.
For people who people don't know this, but I shared a particular new emoji with Cructose. That is absolutely hilarious, that he's having a great time with his kids and stuff. So.
Oh, it's awesome. I've used it 3 or 4 times now, especially with my 19-year-old in particular, because she, more than any of the other kids, she takes after me, and she really needs to know that Jesus is peeking in, looking at her.
Well, listen, man, thanks so much. This has been a blast, and I really hope that you get a good reception. The listeners enjoy this one, because I think this really was really some wrapping up, combining a lot of the stuff that we've been discussing together on your podcast for a while now. So. Yeah,
it'll be a couple days before it even goes out to the paid, because just an hour ago I actually recorded a really fun conversation with Duncan Rayburn about the nature of the holy in the technological system. So for those that are listening, they'll have probably, because I just finished my conversation with Duncan and used some of the things I was talking about an hour ago with Duncan. When this comes out in 2 or 3 or 4 days, they'll realize, like, hey, that sounds like, the reason why it sounds like the same themes as you just heard 2 or 3 days ago is because the 2 conversations happened an hour apart.
Yeah. All right.
Very good, Athenian. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care, brother.